Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise against the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea.
Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us.
Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Keep marching on, stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat, have our weary feet come to the place for which our parents sighed. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the sword. Out from the gloomy past till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast, our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far all along the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places our God where we met thee, must shadow beneath thy hand, may we forever stand true to our God, true to our native land. Lift every voice, lift every voice, every voice, every voice.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Shauna Oshiro, tenor of Halo Quartet and Executive Director of Halo Incorporated. We are pleased and excited to share with you this virtual concert as the culminating presentation of our first virtual series with participants hailing from all over the United States. Race and Real Talk, sharing spaces.
Race and #Real Talk is the vision that was born when we, Halo Quartet, broke new ground in the barbershop world as the first quartet of African American singers to compete on the international stage of any major barbershop organization. Barbershop organizations have existed since 1938. We competed for the first time on the international stage in 2015. This breakthrough illuminated the residues of racism that manifest in our society as a continued result of racist practices, like those that prevented African Americans from being part of communities, like the organizations that thrive on the music they created.
And still, the community created by Barbershop singing was the inspiration for the healing that could come from intentionally embracing the opportunity for togetherness and harmony. With the clinical leadership of Shauna Oshiro, board certified music therapist, and Niambi Powell, a licensed clinical social worker, Halo engages, builds, and recreates with communities, using barbershop music and singing as a metaphor to address the issues that continue to marginalize Black and Indigenous people of color, keeping us apart because of the social construct that is racism.
In the first quarter of our series, Sharing Spaces, this is the question we explored pertaining to racism. What keeps us apart? Using Halo's unique barbershop metaphor, we engaged a variety of sources to learn about, reflect on, and discuss the realities of racist housing policies, the effects of those policies on opportunities in education, how these effects influence career opportunities, and how we experience the cumulative effects in our personal relationships across racial identities. Our goal is to work toward a better collective understanding of the shared truth to embrace rather than withdraw from the tension that emerges when we engage across differences of personal background and even political beliefs when it comes to racism in the United States and across the world. And we use this understanding to influence meaningful change in ourselves and in the spaces that we share in this society. Whether we're unaware of these problems or exhausted from their realities in our lives, something has to change in all of us. Otherwise, we'll be singing the same old song for generations to come.
You're sweet as a honeybee, but like a honeybee stings, you've gone and left my heart in pain. All you left was a favorite song, the one we danced to all night long. It used to bring sweet memories of a tender love that used to be, but it's the same old song, but with a different meaning since you've been gone. But it's the same old song, but with a different meaning since you've been gone. Sweet ceremony to hearing no love song. I wanna cry, but the melody keeps haunting me, reminding me how in love we used to be. Keep hearing the part that used to touch our hearts, staying together forever, breaking up never. It's the same old song, but with a different meaning since you've been gone. But it's the same old song, but with a different meaning since you've been gone. Precious memories keep on lingering on. Every time I hear my favorite song, now you're gone. Just this empty night, I only reminisce of the happiness we spent. We used to dance to the music, make romance to the music, but it's the same old song, with a different meaning since you've been gone. But it's the same old song, but with a different meaning since you've been gone.
A significant challenge I find as an Afro-Latina is how do we have real talk about racism and what keeps us apart without singing the same old song? and it is within the historical evidence addressing segregation, reading chapters of Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. Decades beyond the civil rights movement, the popular belief that community segregation is a de facto phenomenon, that we just naturally prefer the community and presence of people who look like us. This rationale, however, it really ignores the policies sanctioned by the government to keep African Americans out of the white neighborhoods. So the first housing project, which were to address the housing shortage for working class families in the wake of the Depression and the war, built separate buildings for white and black, where housing for black people was much poorer quality to begin with. Then once there was more housing available in the 1950s, the Federal Housing Administration financed constructions for communities designed for low mortgage home ownership. One condition, that they do not permit African American families to purchase those homes. Sound familiar? These policies, mind you, actually created segregation in communities that already integrated, a practice in lockstep with the earlier Jim Crow policies, which a former California Housing Commissioner wrote were imposed under the guise of respecting local attitudes. So you fast forward to the 1960s, and the dwelling for public housing had deteriorated from lack of adequate resources for maintenance, transforming it to a warehouse system for the poor. Middle-class white folks who had come to associate with this monstrous, depressing, run-down, crime-ridden places, like Nixon said in 1973, with black people did not want public housing, or the black people who needed it, near their respectable neighborhoods. And fast forward through more delayed policies, changing and continued discriminatory practices in real estate. Today, there are communities across the nation that are even more segregated in the 21st century than they were like 100 years ago.
To quote Rothstein from The Color of Law, "We've left untouched the biggest segregation of all, that overwhelms everything else and hangs over our entire society. And that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated." That was from a speech he gave in 2020, this year. Week after week in this group, we discussed deeply and meaningfully in our small groups, and then we would return to one large group for a continued dialogue, asking ourselves collectively, why is it so important that we talk about this? And what happens if we don't? Here's our answer, at least what I took away from all of this. Without understanding the depths of segregation's impacts, it's easy to minimize or even completely disregard racism as a reality, as well as to ignore its current manifestations. It's easy for white people and for people who deny racism to say that racism isn't really a thing, or that it's not worth spending a whole lot of time on, or that it quite simply doesn't even exist. And then there's the toll of gentrification. The people who lived there pre-gentrification can't afford it anymore. This is a familiar narrative in cities all across the United States. According to an article from The Atlantic in 2015, as wealthier residents flow back into once low-income, often minority neighborhoods, longtime residents can be priced out.
Although there have been some provisions for enforcing equity in housing, such as the 1965 Fair Housing Act, the Supreme Court's 1968 Jones v. Mayer decision, bans on exclusionary zoning laws, and homeowner association restrictions, as well as other reforms, government and legal entities have failed to ensure that counteractive measures are being implemented or having the desired effect. In fact, in agreement with Rothstein, our discussions in Race and #Real Talk lifted up that even when we do recognize that government policies have created and supported an unconstitutional de jure system of residential segregation, it does not follow that litigation can remedy the situation. We, all of us, are responsible for addressing and dismantling the subsystems that uphold the pervasive system of white supremacy culture. We will effect changes through where we choose to live, with whom we do business, where our children go to school, and the interactions we have with people. We will change the culture through what we teach our children at home and in school. This is accomplished through modeling equity and inclusion in our words and actions, as well as through the accuracy of resources and texts about history and government. Nevertheless, this goes beyond our individual actions and choices. We must work for racial justice through government policies and other legal means to break down a system that has oppressed so many people for far too long.
The issue of segregation also impacts education, which is a major cornerstone in our society and culture. School districts across America end up being segregated because our communities are still segregated. White residents of districts also react negatively to the prospects of integration because students of color are associated with lower performance and fewer resources than white schools. The prevalence of choice enrollment also contributes to this disparity. Families close to school boundaries can choose to enroll their children in a different school. For example, a family living within the boundary of a Title I school can choice enroll their student into a non-Title I school. Title I schools are those that receive federal Title I funds and are usually located in a lower income community and attended by students of a lower socioeconomic status, often BIPOC families.
On the other hand, many parents who attempt to work the system from the other side, who are often Black and Indigenous people of color, receive criminal penalties for trying to get their children across the zoning boundaries that separate them from higher quality education. And it's not simply that the schools in less affluent neighborhoods and communities of color have less competent teachers or administration. They don't have the same resources. Public schools and their districts rely heavily on revenue allocated from property taxes for their funding. How is the right to education equal when their resources are directly correlated with the wealth of their residents and the value of their properties? Pair this lack of adequate resources for educational funding with the prejudiced attitudes held against many students of color that leads to more severe disciplinary action and biased treatment by teachers and administrators, and the experience reinforces the pervasive narrative that they are less valued and less valuable to society. And of course, there are plenty of these students who still rise to the opportunity for higher education, but how does the quality of their secondary education measure up? With many performing musicians, music educators, and music therapists in this group, we were able to see the specific instance of higher education in music and how poorly resourced secondary schools make it that much more challenging for students to succeed in college and in their careers. When schools can't afford music programs, students don't have the privilege of the knowledge base that allows them to be competitive in their applications, enrollment, or matriculation. This limited access to higher education then filters out a great deal of young people of color who could thrive in and contribute to these fields. And along with them goes the perspective among leaders in education, clinical practice, and performance to help shape the spaces of these and other professions. And often for many of those people of color who do make it through that filter, the constructs of professionalism created and reinforced by perspectives of generations of white leaders exclude the authentic presentation of their identity and perspective of their expertise.
In one of our sessions, faculty from the NCCU Music Department joined us to share how they've witnessed these barriers to higher education and professional development for their students in a historically Black university. Their talent is a poignant testament to the beauty our society is missing out on when students and people of color don't get to live and sing their truth.
We see how segregation affects the resources available to students depending on the communities in which they live. We also looked at how racism is manifest in keeping us apart in the workplace and organizational spaces we share. In our Race and Real Talk sessions, using the barbershop metaphor, we practiced discussing and thinking about these issues from different perspectives and reviewed some studies on the subject. One article we read, titled "Our Choices as Employees May Lead to Workplace Segregation," showed that most people tend to be in favor of diversity and inclusion principles in theory. But if put into practice such that they would become the minority, they would be less likely to stay or want to stay working in this environment. This was true across racial identities of study participants, which suggests that the attitudes that we cultivate from living in highly segregated communities stay with us, and they prevent us from connecting with each other when our spaces later intersect. In another survey of American workers, 45% reported experiencing discrimination in the workplace. The preferences mentioned before for working in environments where one is not the minority likely reflect both the comfort we have with those we perceive to be similar or familiar to us, as well as the discomfort or even hostility toward those we've learned to see as threatening and or less competent.
It also gets complicated in professional and community spaces working towards diversity and inclusion when these initiatives, often as a byproduct of the existing issues of dominance of white culture, are led by predominantly white teams. What this quest for inclusion often turns into for people of color is tokenism. For example, we need someone to check for discrimination in human resources. So since you are Black, Asian, Latina, etc., we'll give this job to you. Or we want to increase our numbers of non-white members from X to Y, or Z. So let's find ways to collect them. Even when teams and leaders feel intentions are good, seeking participation from people of color to accommodate pre-existing agendas of white leadership is not really inclusion at all. Yielding positions of people in order to diversify representation and in various areas of leadership, however, that can result in shifting patterns of agendas, such as new goals and even values that represent those held by people and communities of color can emerge. But even when these commitments are made, I think it's still difficult and complicated when racism and inequality block or discipline people of color from entering those spaces willingly.
In many cases, Black, Indigenous, and people of color aren't working in positions where they can affect policy changes to make new policies and change existing ones to be intentional about promoting inclusion and diversity, rather than the policies being merely non-exclusionary. Additionally, there's discomfort and tension that arises when any entity wants to collect data regarding representation, employment, and demographics, both on the side of those collecting the data and on those being asked. But without accurate data, how can those who make and control the policies work to address issues with diversity and inclusion in meaningful ways in professional spaces?
At times, BIPOCs may forego participating in efforts related to workplace and organizational changes because existing power structures, dynamics, and values are not conducive to the act of leaning in to do genuine and real work that could bring about meaningful changes. Essentially, many workplaces have printed mission statements and policies that acknowledge diversity and their intentions to be inclusive. However, what is written is often misaligned with what is frequently observed. In contemplation of challenging the status quo, one question that may surface within the minds of BIPOCs is whose comfort matters more? If the comfort of the dominant group remains the priority, then organizations will remain complicit in exclusionary practices. How can I give you all the things I can if you're tying both of my hands?
Bum bum bow, ba-da-dow, ba-da, bum bum bow, ba-da-dow, ba-da. A little less conversation, a little more action, please. All this aggravation means satisfaction in me. A little more bite, a little less bark, a little less fight, a little more spark. Close your your mouth and open up your heart and baby satisfy me. Satisfy me, baby. Baby, close your eyes and listen to the music. Take it to the summer breeze. It's a groovy night, show you how to use it. Come along with me and put your mind at ease. A little less conversation, a little more action, please. All this aggravation needs satisfaction in me. No, a little more bite, a little less bark, a little less fight, a little more spark. Close your mouth and open up your heart. Satisfy me, satisfy me, Do you satisfy me? Do you satisfy me? Come on, baby, I'm tired of talking. Grab your coat and let's start walking. Come on, come on. Come on, come on. Come on, come on. Come on, come on. Don't procrastinate, don't articulate. Boy, it's getting late. You just say when we're out. Give me a little less conversation, a little more action, please. Now all this aggravation and satisfaction in me. A little more bite, a little less spark, a little less fight, a little more spark. Close your mouth and open up your heart and baby satisfy me, oh please. Please satisfy me. Less conversation, a little more action, please. Yeah, all this aggravation ain't satisfaction in me, no. A little more bite, a little less spark, a little less fight, a little more spark. Close your mouth and open up your heart and baby satisfy me, oh please satisfy me. Won't you satisfy me? Satisfy, satisfy, say a little satisfy, 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 satisfy. It's me, satisfy,
When any of us enters a social space or a conversation with someone else, we put forward a different version of ourselves depending on who we're with. And this can be hard work. The more of yourself that you need to suppress, or even just the amount of calculation you need to do to decide whether what you say will be considered appropriate by the people around you, can be really tiring and unappealing. Unfortunately, the dominance of white cultural norms puts the onus on Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color to do an unfair amount of that work, because they're expected to meet white people on our terms. And more often than not, those terms minimize, omit, or outright deny the experiences and realities of BIPOC life. This is incredibly exhausting and unwelcoming, and it plays a huge role in stifling growth and keeping us apart in our personal relationships.
These weeks have been a remarkable exploration. Joyful, warm, uncomfortable, amazing, confusing. Earning the confidence from others, learning confidence in myself, totally worth the work, totally worth the work. It's reminded me how my white-skinned life has given me a choice between quiet safety and the roar of risk. Make no mistake, my whispered, "That wasn't funny," roared in people's ears, in my friends' ears, and they roared back at me with their rolled eyes or stiffened spines and jaws. As a child, me saying, "Oh, we say catch a tiger by the toe," went over much better. Much better if the new friends hadn't met my mixed race family. Adulthood was my chance to duck, to not be the mole in Whack-A-Mole, the etiquette edition, the white etiquette edition. My chance to run from the roar, that was adulthood. Keep my head down. At the start of this race and real talk time, I'd lost my muscle memory, my memory of the weight of carrying this target on my back, on my forehead, everywhere. Bit by bit, this is teaching me to carry it again. Race and Real Talk is reteaching me to speak the Black stories and melodies. The voice is silenced, whacked down every time. Okay, this is good. Every time they popped up, people are resting for the next task. So I am relearning to speak up. That's exciting. To speak up, to sing out. My sisters and brothers need rest after 400 years. You do, you need rest. Take the rest. I need practice to listen louder to you and to listen louder to that lost part of me. And I will learn your story. I will remember mine. Listen louder, and with your help, I will relearn to speak it daily. And that's from this experience. It's been magnificent.
All of this separation, segregation, inequality, tokenization, and marginalization can leave a Black, Indigenous person of color uncomfortable, even physically unsafe in predominantly white spaces, especially those filled with political leaders who make blatantly racist policies and statements. Just witnessing the way some white people react to Black, Indigenous people of color can be uncomfortable. We are left to navigate from a place of self-preservation, becoming hyper-conscious of how we present. In fact, for some of us, our instinct is to hold back and be very selective about the relationships we form and who we allow into our intimate circle of friends. As we sing the song, "There Ain't No Way for Me to Love You If You Won't Let Me," Black, Indigenous people of color tend to be drawn to one another to feel affirmed in our identity and experience.
Understanding the realities of racism requires doing the work of research and thought. Building relationships deepens that understanding through sharing lived experiences of racial oppression and struggle. But lived experiences, apart from the mere information and facts, are a privilege of intimacy. Being asked, or even expected, to share those experiences outside of an intimate, trusted relationship can trigger trauma for many Black, Indigenous people of color. Just because someone holds an identity as a Black, Indigenous person of color doesn't mean they're required to inform or share personal stories with anyone.
I want to take this time to also thank Halo Incorporated for doing Race and Real Talk. This is a wonderful space, safe space for Black, Indigenous people of color and for white people to get together and discuss these political views or segregation, separation that is happening in our world today. This class will help you have an understanding of not just Black, Indigenous people of color's views, but also makes you think about yourself and how you see people.
Go out and tell our story. Let it echo far and wide. Make them hear you. Make them hear you. How justice was our battle and how justice was denied. Make them hear you. Make them hear you. And say to those who blame us for the way we chose to fight, sometimes there are battles that are more than black or white. And I will not lay down my sword. Justice was my right. Make them hear you. Make them hear you. Go out and tell our story to your daughters and your sons. Make them hear you. Make them hear you. And tell them in our struggle we were not the only ones. Make them hear you. Make them hear you. Your sword could be a sermon or the power of the pen. Teach every child to raise his voice, and then my brothers then will justice be demanded by 10 million righteous men. Make them hear you. When they hear you, I'll be near you again.
Barbershop is both a metaphor and a guide during Race and Real Talk. In each session, we attempted to parallel the rich synergy that comes from different voices joining together, each singing their own version of the same song. And just as the melody is always at the center of the barbershop sound, it is the lived experiences of Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized races that must be at the center of conversations about race. It was sometimes challenging for those of us who are white to share our thoughts and experiences without inadvertently recentering the conversation to the dominant race and culture. We had to remind ourselves that it's not about how we feel. Rather, we want to hear, value, and amplify the voices of those who experience racism. Attempting to discuss racial issues from a white point of view is a little like trying to sing a barbershop song without a lead. You can do it, and there's certainly value in working the harmony parts in a rehearsal, but the song becomes strangely hollow and sometimes confusing. No matter how accurately or artistically the baritone, bass, and tenor parts are sung, they are incomplete without the lead at the center.
It's easy to avoid taking on hard conversations because the tension makes us uncomfortable. We may feel that we're trying not to hurt others' feelings, though as white people we may be protecting ourselves from feeling guilty. In any challenging situation, but especially in difficult conversations like these, avoiding the tension and struggle does not solve the problem. More often it festers beneath the surface and grows into a larger issue that becomes even harder to resolve. But growth and learning require discomfort. We make the biggest strides when we can lean into the tension and allow ourselves to discover what that striving can teach us. And by encouraging others to join in the work, to embrace the tension and struggle together to resolve it, we make strides towards a more equitable and just society.
We learned this song together, recorded our individual voice parts, and then shared those recordings with our group as part of the process. This was a vulnerability that many of us felt on a deep level. Many of us also felt this desire for perfection, reticent to contribute because we were focused on that individual product. We recognize together that we are all coming into this process from very different places. Some of us had very little singing experience, while others were singing the same voice part for many years. We experienced that power of showing up in this process where we are, as we are, stop trying to be something we're not, and turn our attention to the beautiful whole. How different it was when we practiced in balance with all of the voice parts. This experience highlighted the same vulnerability in the conversations we engaged in together. That desire for perfection or self-focus in conversation, just as in singing, we found actually inhibits authenticity and engagement, which keeps us apart. When we showed up authentically and leaned into that vulnerability, we recognized the whole is greater, beautiful, and everybody's contribution is necessary to make it more beautiful, in barbershop singing and in these conversations.
Permission to struggle, to learn, to ask the right questions, to let go of perfectionism. We can be true to ourselves when we lean into the tension and share and create a space where everyone has permission to be authentic and work toward real change. We exist in a system that keeps us apart in its structures and its existing values and paradigms. Without intentionally coming together to dismantle it, there ain't no way we can truly connect or rise above it.
For me to love you.
Thank you for watching this Race and Real Talk presentation of Sharing Spaces, What Keeps Us Apart. We would like to extend special thanks and acknowledgement to our virtual ensemble tech team, Cliff Shoemaker, Sarah Jebian, and Manoj Plotke, for their incredible help and support to make this virtual concert possible. We also want to thank Dr. Alan Lloyd for her beautiful arrangement of Aretha Franklin's Ain't No Way. We hope to have stirred some new energy in this community and in your hearts and minds that will propel us all to contribute to the growth our society needs to make real change. One way that you can contribute to the changes we want to make and see is through your donations. And by donating to the link below from now through December 31st of 2020, your contributions will be shared with the North Carolina Central University Department, the historically Black college and university partnering with us for this program, whose faculty joined us to share racism's effects on education and opportunity, and whose students shared their beautiful singing with us for this project. And you can also contribute to this cause and the conversation by joining us for our Afterglow at 9:30 p.m. today, December 12th, beginning at 9:30 p.m. EST. Register at the link to our event at Eventbrite, and these proceeds will also benefit Halo and the North Carolina Central University Music Scholarships. We encourage you to consider finding and supporting other causes devoted to addressing and reversing the effects of systemic racism for BIPOC individuals and communities. Whatever the form of your resources, it's time for us to take the national conversation about racism to a new level of cooperative action and commitment for change. Thank you.
A little less conversation, a little more action, please. All this aggravation means satisfaction in me. A little more bite, a little less bark, a little less fight, a little more spark. Close your mouth and open up your heart and baby satisfy me. Satisfy me, baby, close your eyes and listen to the music. Take to the summer breeze. It's a groovy band, I can show you how to use it. Come along with me and put your mind at ease. A little less conversation, a little more action, please. All this aggravation needs satisfaction in me.